My name is Sarah. I am 32 years old, and I can still taste the bitter dust in the air from the morning my entire world collapsed into a pile of shattered wood and broken memories. I was standing on the front lawn of my childhood home, the very house my late parents had built with their own hands, staring in absolute horror at the massive yellow bulldozer idling aggressively just inches from the front porch. The heavy diesel engine rattled my bones, but the real earthquake was happening inside my chest. Just 24 hours earlier, my father's wealthy brother, my Uncle Richard, a 58-year-old real estate developer, had looked me dead in the eyes and promised he would help me save this house from the bank. I had hugged him, crying tears of sheer relief, believing family had finally come through. But now, as I watched his driver pull the levers and the massive steel blade crash into the wooden pillars of the porch, a cold, paralyzing sickness washed over me. I was not just losing a building. I was being erased by my own blood. Every happy memory was being chewed up by metal treads, while Richard sat in his luxury car across the street, watching my life turn into rubble with a sickening smirk on his face. My knees gave out, hitting the damp grass as the roof caved in, and right then, amidst the deafening roar of destruction, I realized the terrifying truth about the trap I had blindly walked into.
To understand how I ended up on my knees that morning, you have to understand what that house meant to me. It was not just a structure of wood and brick. It was the physical embodiment of my family's love. My father had laid every single brick of the foundation, and my mother had planted the oak trees that framed the driveway. Growing up, our home was the center of our universe. We did not have a lot of money, but we had warmth, laughter, and a sense of absolute security. That security began to crack when I was 25, the year my mother was diagnosed with a relentless and aggressive illness. The medical bills piled up faster than we could ever hope to pay them. My father, a proud and hard-working man, took out a second mortgage on the house to cover the costs of her treatments. He would work double shifts at the factory, coming home with his hands calloused and his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but he never complained. He did it all because he loved her deeply. Despite his heroic efforts, my mother passed away 3 years later, leaving behind a void that nothing could ever fill. The grief was completely overwhelming, but the financial devastation was just as brutal. My father tried to keep up with the payments, but the heartbreak had taken its toll on his physical health. 2 years after losing my mother, his heart simply gave out. I was suddenly entirely alone in the world, inheriting not only the home I cherished, but also a mountain of debt that threatened to crush me. I was working a modest job as a graphic designer, barely making enough to cover my own basic living expenses, let alone a massive ballooning mortgage. Every time the phone rang, my stomach would tie itself into painful knots because I knew it was the bank calling to demand money I simply did not have. I spent my nights sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of final notices and threatening letters, crying until my eyes burned and my head pounded fiercely. In the midst of this overwhelming nightmare, my only anchor to sanity was my best friend, Jessica, a 32-year-old accountant who had known me since we were in kindergarten. One rainy Tuesday evening, she came over with a box of cheap pizza and a stack of financial spreadsheets, determined to help me find a way out of the mess. Jessica looked at the numbers, her brow furrowed in deep concentration, and finally let out a heavy, defeated sigh. She told me the harsh truth. The bank was moving forward with foreclosure proceedings, and unless I could come up with $50,000 in the next 30 days, the house would be auctioned off. The words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I had exhausted all my savings and maxed out my credit cards. I buried my face in my hands, sobbing uncontrollably.
It was in that moment of absolute crushing despair that she gently asked if I had considered reaching out to my Uncle Richard, a ruthless, incredibly wealthy real estate developer. I immediately rejected Jessica's suggestion, shaking my head violently. I told her I would rather live in my car than ask that arrogant, selfish man for a single dime. But Jessica reminded me that pride would not pay the mortgage, and that if I truly wanted to save my parents' home, I had to exhaust every possible avenue. She pointed out that Richard had the kind of wealth where $50,000 was nothing more than a rounding error. I spent the entire night agonizing over the decision. I realized Jessica was right. The next morning, with my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, I dialed his corporate office. To my absolute shock, when I explained the dire situation with the bank, he did not hang up or laugh. His tone softened, taking on a paternal warmth. He told me how deeply sorry he was to hear about my struggles and insisted that family needed to stick together in times of crisis. He invited me to come to his office the following afternoon to discuss a solution. The following day, I put on my best professional outfit, trying to look respectable and responsible, and drove to Richard's downtown office. His company occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper. Walking out of the elevator, I was immediately intimidated by the sheer opulence of the place. There were marble floors, original modern art on the walls, and expansive windows offering a panoramic view of the entire city. I felt like a tiny, insignificant mouse entering the lair of a very well-fed lion. Richard's assistant ushered me into his massive corner office. He was sitting behind a sprawling mahogany desk, dressed in a sharply tailored suit. When he saw me, he stood up, walked around the desk, and pulled me into a tight, theatrical hug. The smell of his expensive cologne was overpowering. He guided me to a plush leather sofa and offered me sparkling water from a crystal decanter. I sat there nervously as he adopted a perfectly rehearsed expression of concern. He told me he had reviewed the financial documents I had emailed his assistant that morning. He shook his head, looking deeply troubled, and said the situation was indeed critical. The bank was vicious, he warned, and they would show no mercy to a young woman on her own. I felt the familiar panic rising in my throat, but then he smiled. It was a broad, reassuring smile that completely disarmed my defenses. He leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees, and delivered the words I had been praying to hear. He said he would help me save the house, and that he would not let the bank take what belongs to our family. I started crying again, thanking him profusely, telling him I would pay back every single cent with interest. He held up a hand, stopping me. He explained that a simple loan would not work because my credit was already ruined. Instead, he proposed what he called a foolproof legal strategy to protect the property completely from the aggressive foreclosure process. Richard explained his plan with the smooth, rapid-fire delivery of a seasoned salesman. He told me that in order to completely shield the house from the bank, we needed to temporarily transfer the deed of the property into a private holding trust controlled by his corporation. He assured me this was a standard, highly effective maneuver used by wealthy investors to protect assets. According to him, his company would immediately pay off the entire outstanding mortgage balance in full, instantly satisfying the bank. The house would then be legally owned by his trust, but only on paper. He promised that once the dust settled and I had a few years to rebuild my credit and save some money, he would transfer the deed right back into my name for a nominal fee of $1. It sounded incredibly complex, but he spoke with such absolute authority and confidence that I felt foolish for even trying to question the mechanics of it. He slid a thick stack of legal documents across the table. The pages were filled with dense, impenetrable legal jargon that made my eyes cross. He handed me a sleek, heavy silver pen and pointed to the various signature lines flagged with bright yellow sticky notes. A tiny, quiet voice in the back of my mind whispered that I should take the papers home, that I should have Jessica or a lawyer look at them first. I hesitated, the pen hovering over the first page. Richard noticed my hesitation immediately. His warm smile faltered just a fraction, replaced by a subtle, manipulative look of disappointment. He sighed heavily, leaning back on the sofa. He told me that the bank's deadline was tomorrow, and that if we did not file this paperwork by the end of the business day, his legal team would not have time to process the payment. He made it clear that this was a one-time offer, a massive favor he was doing solely out of the goodness of his heart. The fear of losing the house instantly overrode my intuition. My hands shaking, I signed. When I signed the final page, Richard beamed. He gathered the documents swiftly and slipped them into a thick manila envelope. He gave me another firm, reassuring hug and told me to get a good night's sleep. I walked out of that skyscraper feeling lighter than I had in years. The suffocating weight of the debt and the agonizing fear of homelessness had all been magically lifted from my shoulders. I drove back to my neighborhood actually smiling. I called Jessica that evening to share the amazing news. She was happy for me, but when I explained the details of the deed transfer,
There was a long, uncomfortable silence. She pointed out that legally speaking, I no longer owned the house. I quickly brushed off her concerns, defending Richard vehemently.
I told her she was being paranoid, that family would never do something so sinister. I went to bed that night feeling victorious, completely unaware that the countdown to my destruction had already begun. I woke up the next morning to a mechanical roar. It was a deep, guttural vibration that seemed to rattle the very foundation of the house. Confused and groggy, I threw off the covers and stumbled to the window. The sight that greeted me made my blood run instantly cold. A massive, bright yellow bulldozer was parked right on my front lawn, its heavy metal treads crushing the beautiful rose bushes my mother had spent years cultivating. Panic exploded in my chest like a bomb. I sprinted down the stairs, threw open the front door, and ran out onto the damp morning grass in my pajamas. I waved my arms frantically, screaming at the top of my lungs over the deafening noise of the engine. The operator cut the engine, leaned out the window, and told me he had a legitimate demolition order from the property owner. He tossed a folded piece of paper down to me. My hands shook violently as I unfolded it. It was a copy of the deed, clearly showing that Richard's corporation was the sole legal owner of the property. It made absolutely no sense at all.
Richard stepped out of his sleek black Mercedes sedan, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit, looking as casual as if he were arriving for a Sunday brunch. I ran toward him, the demolition permit clutched in my trembling fist, tears of confusion and rage streaming down my face. I demanded to know what was going on, begging him to tell the operator to leave. Richard did not offer a warm smile or a theatrical hug this time. His face was a mask of cold, calculating indifference. He looked at me, then looked at the house, and let out a small, dismissive sigh. He spoke in a calm, flat tone that was infinitely more terrifying than if he had been screaming. He told me that there was no mistake. He explained with chilling detachment that the plot of land my parents' house sat on had recently been rezoned for high-density commercial development. The house itself was practically worthless to him, but the land was an absolute gold mine that he had coveted for many long years. He revealed that he had been trying to buy this specific block for a massive luxury condominium project, but my father had stubbornly refused to sell for years.
When I came crying to him about the foreclosure, he saw the perfect opportunity to finally acquire the last piece of the puzzle for a fraction of its true market value. My jaw dropped in absolute horror. The betrayal was so profound, so intensely cruel, that I physically could not breathe. I was gasping for air, clutching my chest. I screamed at him that he was a monster, that he had looked me in the eye and promised to help me save my home. Richard simply chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He looked at me with an expression of profound pity, as if I were a foolish child who had not read the fine print of life. He told me he had saved the property from the bank, but now he owned it, and it was just business. He gave me exactly 15 minutes to get my personal belongings out before the entire roof came crashing down. He turned his back on me, walked over to the bulldozer operator, and gave a sharp nod. The massive diesel engine roared back to life, the sound hitting me like a physical assault.
The next 15 minutes were a frantic, surreal nightmare. I ran back inside the house, my mind completely fractured, trying to decide what pieces of my entire life were worth saving in the span of a few moments. I grabbed a duffel bag and blindly shoved clothes into it. I ran to the living room and snatched the framed photographs of my parents from the mantelpiece, the glass cutting into my palm as I clutched them to my chest. I grabbed my mother's favorite jewelry box and my father's old watch. Every time I turned around, another memory screamed at me to save it, but I could hear the hydraulic whine of the bulldozer moving closer. I ran out the back door just as the massive steel blade made contact with the front porch. The sound of the wood splintering and screaming was absolutely agonizing. I stood on the sidewalk, shivering in the morning chill, clutching my pathetic duffel bag, and watched as the machine methodically tore my history to shreds. The roof caved in with a thunderous crash, sending a massive plume of gray dust into the air.
The walls where my height had been measured every year, the kitchen where I had learned to bake, the living room where my family had spent countless Christmases, all of it was reduced to a chaotic pile of shattered timber and broken drywall in a matter of minutes. The dust coated my skin, getting into my eyes and my mouth, tasting bitter and foul. I fell to my knees on the pavement, completely broken. I did not just feel betrayed, I felt utterly destroyed.
My own uncle had weaponized my grief and my desperation to steal my parents' legacy. I watched him get back into his pristine black Mercedes and drive away without ever looking back, leaving me homeless, penniless, and suffocating alone in the grim ruins of my shattered past. I do not remember how long I sat there on the sidewalk, staring blankly at the rubble. Eventually, Jessica arrived. She threw her car into park, ran over to me, and pulled me into her arms. I collapsed against her, sobbing until my throat was raw and my vision went completely black. She helped me into her car, drove me to her small apartment, and put me in her spare bedroom. For the first 2 weeks, I was a ghost. I barely ate, I barely slept, and I could not stop crying.
Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard smirk and heard the deafening crash of the roof caving in. The humiliation was a physical weight that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. But as the days dragged on, the profound, paralyzing sorrow slowly began to curdle into something else. The tears dried up, leaving behind a hard, burning knot in the pit of my stomach. The sadness was being replaced by a pure, unadulterated, white-hot rage. I realized that crying was exactly what he expected. He thought he had won. He thought I was just going to disappear and let him build his luxury condos on the graves of my memories. That realization snapped something inside of me. I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I was going to tear his empire down, brick by expensive brick.
The path to vengeance, however, was incredibly daunting. I spent hours every day at the local public library using their free internet to research real estate fraud, contract law, and zoning regulations. My relentless research eventually led me to a man named Mr. Davis, a 60-year-old, fiercely independent attorney who had a reputation for taking on impossible high-stakes cases against corrupt corporations. When I walked into his cluttered office, I told him the entire story. He listened silently, his expression grim. When I finished, he explained that the law heavily penalizes fraud in the inducement. If we could conclusively prove that Richard had deliberately lied to me, we could destroy his entire plan. We needed hard, undeniable evidence that he had planned to demolish the house and build condos long before I ever walked into his office. To afford Mr. Davis's reduced retainer fee, I took on a second job working the night shift at a diner. The legal discovery phase was a brutal, drawn-out battle. Richard's expensive lawyers fought us at every single turn, burying us in thousands of pages of irrelevant documents. But arrogance eventually makes everyone sloppy. Late one Friday night, while I was poring over a massive box of printed emails, my eyes caught a mundane correspondence between Richard and a prominent city councilman. The email was dated a full 6 months before I had ever contacted Richard for help. In it, Richard explicitly outlined his aggressive plan to acquire my parents' property, noting that my father was dead and I was drowning in debt. Attached to the email were the finalized architectural blueprints for the luxury condominium complex, clearly showing my house already erased from the map. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was the smoking gun. Armed with this devastating evidence, Mr. Davis and I decided not to just spring it in a quiet courtroom. We discovered that Richard was scheduled to present his final proposal for the project at a highly publicized open city council meeting the following week. He needed the council to approve a final zoning variance. The meeting was packed with wealthy investors, politicians, and reporters. Jessica and I sat quietly in the back row, while Mr. Davis stood near the aisle. Richard stood at the podium looking incredibly smug, talking smoothly about how his project would bring immense value to the community. When he finished his slick presentation, the council chairman opened the floor for public comment. Mr. Davis strode confidently down the center aisle, introduced himself as my legal counsel, and formally requested to submit evidence relevant to the property's acquisition. Richard's smug smile instantly vanished, his face draining of color. With surgical precision, Mr. Davis laid out the entire fraudulent scheme for everyone in the room to hear. He detailed the deception, the manipulation of a grieving niece, and the illegal coercion. Then he held up the copies of the damning email exchange. He read the email aloud, emphasizing the cold, predatory words Richard had used to describe my financial desperation. He passed copies of the documents to the council members and the press. I watched Richard's face contort in panic. The investors sitting in the front row began whispering furiously among themselves, casting disgusted glares in his direction.
The reporters were snapping photos and furiously typing on their phones, sensing a massive scandal brewing.
The council chairman immediately announced that the zoning vote would be suspended pending a full legal investigation into the fraudulent acquisition of the land. The meeting descended into total chaos. As Richard tried to scurry out a side door, I stood up and blocked his path. We locked eyes. The arrogance that had been there on the morning of the bulldozer was completely gone, replaced by genuine fear and profound humiliation. I told him that he had destroyed my house, but he had failed to destroy me, and now he was going to lose everything. He pushed past me, fleeing into the night in absolute disgrace. The fallout from the city council meeting was swift and utterly devastating for Richard. His major investors panicked and pulled their funding from the condominium project, causing the entire development to collapse overnight. Facing a massive civil lawsuit for fraud with irrefutable evidence against him, he was completely ruined. Mr. Davis was relentless. We did not just demand the return of the property, we demanded severe punitive damages for the emotional distress and the destruction of the house.
In the end, Richard was forced to sign over the deed to the land back to me, completely clear of any mortgages or liens, and pay a multi-million-dollar settlement. The massive financial penalty nearly bankrupted his company, permanently destroying his reputation in the city. A few months later, I stood on that same empty plot of land where I had once cried in despair. I was not going to build a replica of the past. I was going to build a brand new house, a beautiful testament to my survival. Looking back on that incredibly dark chapter of my life, the most profound lesson I learned is that blood does not always make someone family, and true monsters often smile at you across a polished desk while offering a helping hand. I learned how to transform my deepest grief into an unstoppable weapon, and I discovered a well of resilience inside myself that I never knew existed. Would you do the same in my place? Until the next story.